In August of 1942, less than 8 months after Pearl Harbor, young American Marines stepped off their landing craft and into a world that felt less like a battlefield and more like a nightmare. Guadalcanal was not a name most Americans had ever heard before the war. It was a remote, steaming island in the Solomon Chain, thick with jungle, mud, insects, and disease. Yet this forgotten patch of land would become the place where America learned what kind of war it was truly fighting in the Pacific. The men who landed there were not seasoned jungle fighters. Many were barely out of high school. They carried heavy packs, outdated maps, and only a vague understanding of what awaited them beyond the tree line. What they did know was simple. If Guadalcanal fell, the Japanese Empire would tighten its grip across the Pacific. Australia would be threatened. American momentum would die before it ever truly began. Guadalcanal had to be taken and held, no matter the cost. At first, the landing seemed almost too easy. Japanese resistance on the beaches was light, and the Americans moved inland quickly, capturing a half-finished airstrip that would soon be called Henderson Field. But that early success was dangerously misleading. The real enemy was not waiting in neat formations. It was hiding in the jungle, watching, listening, and preparing. The environment itself turned against the Americans almost immediately. The heat was suffocating, the humidity relentless. Sweat-soaked uniforms within minutes. Boots never truly dried. Every step through the jungle felt like a fight against the earth itself. Thick vines, sharp roots, and sucking mud that clung to legs and dragged men down. Mosquitoes swarmed constantly, carrying malaria that would incapacitate thousands. Dysentery spread through contaminated water. Skin rotted. Feet broke down. The jungle did not care who won the war. Supplies were scarce from the beginning. Japanese naval power still dominated the surrounding waters, and American supply lines were fragile and unreliable. Food ran short quickly. Rations were reduced to a handful of rice, hardtack, or whatever could be scavenged. Men lost weight rapidly. Hunger became a constant presence, gnawing at the mind and weakening the body. Yet even as their strength faded, their orders did not change. Hold the island. As night fell, fear took on a new shape. The jungle came alive in darkness. Strange sounds echoed through the trees. Footsteps, whispers, metallic clicks. Japanese soldiers, specialized in night warfare, slipping through American lines silently, launching sudden attacks designed to terrify and exhaust. Flares would rip through the darkness, revealing brief, horrifying glimpses of figures charging through the trees. Screams, gunfire, and confusion followed. Sleep became rare. When it came, it was shallow and broken. For many Americans on Guadalcanal, this was their first real experience of war. Not the clean battles shown in newspapers or recruitment posters, but a grinding test of endurance where survival itself felt like an achievement. There were no clear victories. Only another sunrise survived. Every day was a struggle against hunger, disease, exhaustion, and an enemy that refused to fight on predictable terms. Guadalcanal was not just a battle for territory. It was a trial by fire. Here, America began to learn the true cost of defeating an empire that would not surrender easily. And as the jungle closed in and the nights grew longer, one truth became clear to every man on that island. This war would not be won quickly, and it would not be won without suffering. As the weeks dragged on, the initial shock of Guadalcanal faded and was replaced by something far worse: slow, grinding attrition. By September 1942, American forces on the island were no longer fighting just to advance. They were fighting simply to stay alive. Hunger, disease, and exhaustion began to claim more men than Japanese bullets, and there was no escape from any of it. Food shortages became critical. Supply ships struggled to reach the island under constant threat from Japanese aircraft and warships. When supplies did arrive, they were often too little and too late. Marines survived on starvation rations. Sometimes a single can of food meant to last an entire day. Men boiled jungle roots, chewed on whatever they could find, and dreamed endlessly of real meals back home. Weight fell off them at alarming rates. Cheeks hollowed, strength faded. Yet, patrols still went out. Defensive lines were still held. Disease spread mercilessly. Malaria tore through units, sending waves of feverish, shaking men to makeshift aid stations that were already overwhelmed. Dysentery left soldiers weak and dehydrated, barely able to stand. Fungal infections rotted skin. Tropical ulcers ate into flesh. There were days when rifles felt heavier than the men carrying them. But there was no relief rotation, no pause. Guadalcanal was the front line, and there was nowhere else to go. Psychological strain settled in just as deeply. The Japanese rarely attacked during daylight. Instead, they waited for night, when fear was strongest and visibility nearly vanished. Darkness on Guadalcanal was absolute. The jungle swallowed sound and light alike. Every rustle of leaves could mean an enemy patrol slipping through the lines. American soldiers learned to sleep with weapons in their hands, fingers resting on triggers, nerves stretched thin. Japanese night attacks were designed to terrorize as much as to kill. Bugles would sound in the darkness, followed by sudden charges and explosions. Grenades landed without warning. Machine guns opened fire from unseen positions. The goal was not just to break through American defenses, but to wear down morale, to convince exhausted, starving men that resistance was hopeless. Sometimes attackers slipped into the lines alone, throwing grenades and disappearing back into the jungle, leaving chaos behind. Artillery bombardments added to the misery. Japanese guns hidden deep in the jungle would shell American positions at random hours, denying sleep and rest. Even when no attack came, the waiting itself was torture. Men stared into the blackness, imagining shapes and movement that might not be there. Until suddenly, they were. Despite everything, the American line held. Not because conditions improved, but because retreat was unthinkable. Guadalcanal had become more than a battlefield. It was a symbol. Losing it would mean admitting that America could not fight this kind of war. Every Marine and soldier understood that, even if no one said it out loud. Camaraderie became the one reliable source of strength. Men shared food, cigarettes, and stories of home. They carried sick comrades when legs gave out. They filled in gaps in the line without being ordered. Leadership emerged not just from officers but from exhausted corporals and privates who refused to let the man next to them fall. By the time autumn rains turned the jungle into a flooded hellscape, the Americans on Guadalcanal were no longer the same men who had landed months earlier. They were thinner, harder, and deeply changed. They had learned that survival itself was a victory, and that the enemy waiting in the jungle was just as determined to break them as the island itself. By October 1942, Guadalcanal had become a battlefield where time itself felt broken. Days blurred together under the crushing heat, and nights stretched endlessly into fear-filled hours that no American on the island would ever forget. This was when the fighting reached its most brutal and personal phase. The Japanese understood that the Americans were exhausted, starving, and sick. They believed one final push, delivered under cover of darkness, could shatter the fragile American grip on the island. The jungle at night was a world without mercy. Visibility dropped to just a few feet. Thick vegetation swallowed moonlight, and clouds often erased the stars entirely. American defensive positions were little more than shallow foxholes carved into mud and roots. Men lay motionless for hours, listening to insects, distant artillery, and the slow pounding of their own hearts. Every sound could mean death. Japanese night attacks came suddenly and violently. Bugles echoed through the darkness, followed by screams meant to terrify. Mortars fell without warning, shaking the ground and filling the air with dirt and shrapnel. Then came the infantry, charging through the jungle in waves. At times, they attacked straight into American machine gun fire. At other times, they slipped silently around the flanks, appearing where no one expected them. Close combat was unavoidable. Fights erupted at distances so short that bayonets, knives, and rifle butts became weapons of survival. Confusion reigned. Men fired at shadows. Orders were shouted and lost in the chaos. The jungle amplified every sound, turning battle into a disorienting roar of gunfire, screams, and explosions. There was no room for hesitation. A moment's delay could mean an enemy grenade, landing in a foxhole. Sleep was nearly non-existent. Even on nights without major attacks, Japanese soldiers crept forward to probe American lines, testing for weakness. Single shots rang out. Flares burst overhead, bathing the jungle in harsh white light for seconds at a time, revealing frozen figures gripping weapons, eyes wide and hollow. When dawn finally arrived, it felt less like relief and more like temporary survival. One of the most desperate moments came during massive Japanese assaults aimed at overrunning Henderson Field. The airstrip was the heart of American control on Guadalcanal. If it fell, the island would fall with it. Wave after wave of attackers charged American positions, driven by orders that demanded victory at any cost. Bodies piled up in front of defensive lines, machine guns overheated, rifle barrels burned hands. Still, the Americans held. What kept them fighting was no longer strategy or optimism, it was stubborn refusal. Refusal to abandon fallen comrades. Refusal to give ground after suffering so much to take it. Every Marine and soldier understood that retreat meant starting over, if they survived at all. The island had taken too much already. Leadership under fire became decisive. Officers and non-commissioned officers moved through gunfire to steady shaken men, to plug gaps, to rally defenses that were on the brink of collapse. Acts of bravery happened quietly and constantly. A machine gunner staying at his post despite wounds. A runner carrying messages through shell fire. A medic crawling forward to reach the wounded under fire. By the end of these nights of terror, something fundamental had changed. The Americans on Guadalcanal had proven, to themselves as much as to the enemy, that they could endure the worst conditions imaginable and still fight. The jungle had not broken them. The hunger had not driven them off. And the relentless night attacks had failed to force surrender. The island was still in American hands, and the war in the Pacific had reached a turning point forged in darkness. By November 1942, the battle for Guadalcanal had transformed into a brutal contest of endurance, and it was becoming clear that the Japanese were nearing the limits of what they could sustain. Months of failed assaults, constant naval losses, and unrelenting American resistance had drained their strength. But for the Americans who had survived on the island, victory did not arrive with celebration or relief. It arrived quietly, weighed down by exhaustion, grief, and the knowledge that nothing could undo what they had endured. Guadalcanal had taken a permanent toll. The fighting did not end with a single decisive moment. Instead, it faded slowly through bitter skirmishes, patrol clashes, and artillery exchanges deep in the jungle. Japanese soldiers, many starving and cut off from resupply, continued to fight with desperate determination. Some launched final, hopeless attacks. Others hid in the jungle, refusing surrender and striking when opportunities appeared. For American patrols, every step forward remained dangerous. Even after months of combat, death could still come suddenly from the trees. When Japanese forces finally began evacuating the island in early 1943, many Americans struggled to accept that it was truly over. The constant pressure they had lived under for months simply vanished. The silence felt unnatural. There were no victory parades, no cheering crowds, no sense of triumph. The men were too thin, too sick, and too scarred for celebration. They had won, but Guadalcanal had stripped away any illusion that war could ever be glorious. The cost was staggering. Thousands of Americans were dead. buried in shallow graves or lost forever in the jungle. Thousands more were wounded, many permanently. Disease had ravaged entire units. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical infections followed survivors long after they left the island. For many, Guadalcanal never truly ended. It returned in nightmares, sudden memories, and the inability to forget nights spent waiting for an enemy that seemed to emerge from the darkness itself. Yet Guadalcanal changed the course of the war, and America itself. Strategically, it was the first major offensive victory against Imperial Japan, halting Japanese expansion and shifting momentum in the Pacific. Psychologically, its impact was even greater. The battle shattered the myth that Japanese forces could not be defeated. It proved that American soldiers and Marines could endure extreme conditions, learn from failure, and adapt faster than their enemy. The lessons paid for in blood on Guadalcanal shaped every campaign that followed. Supply chains were redesigned, jungle warfare tactics improved. Commanders learned hard truths about leadership under fire. The men who survived Guadalcanal carried their experience forward to Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They became the backbone of a force hardened by suffering and capable of pushing all the way to Japan's doorstep. Back home, Guadalcanal became a symbol of sacrifice and resolve. Families followed the news anxiously, aware that the island's name represented sons, brothers, and husbands fighting under unimaginable conditions. It reinforced a growing understanding across the nation that this war would not be short or easy, but that America would not turn away from it. Today, the island is quiet. The jungle has reclaimed the scars left by artillery and trenches. But beneath that silence lies the memory of starving Americans who refused to give ground, who held the line when logic said they should collapse. Guadalcanal was not just a battle. It was the moment America proved it could endure a war without mercy and choose again and again to fight on.